As I explained in the beginning of the first video, this review has been cut into two different parts due to length. The part one, which is the other video that you're not currently watching, includes the main point of the Dragon Reborn and some discussion about the boys, Rand, Mat, and Perrin. This section that you're about to watch talks about Egwene and Nynaeve, the ending, Baal Zaman, Callandor, and a couple of other little miscellaneous points. So if you haven't already seen part one, I'd recommend you go watch that first. This was really made to be one video, and I just kind of split it in half. If you already saw part one, then good, you're in the right place for part two. And of course, let me know in the comments if you'd prefer in the future if I continue to cut up videos like this, if they're longer than an hour, or if you actually would prefer it just to be in one unit so you don't have to deal with different links in different videos. With that out of the way, let's start talking about Egwene and Nynaeve. Okay, let's talk about Egwene, Nynaeve, and Elaine. Now, the major conflict they actually had in this book was not magical in the slightest. It was just teamwork problems. But before we get into that, let's spend a couple minutes just talking about the cool magical stuff that we saw too. The most significant of which is probably Egwene's dreaming, which is very cool. We already talked a bit about how she had that glimpse of Mat from her prophetic dreaming, which is a very cool thing she can do. It helps give us little tastes of kind of prophecies and little maybe spoilers for things happening in the future. But it's also just a neat ability, and I think we're going to see more of this in the future. Now, granted, so far it's a little bit overshadowed by Perrin's wolf dreaming, if only because in Perrin's dreams he gets to hang out with Hopper, and in Egwene's dreams she doesn't get to hang out with Hopper, so it's not really a fair comparison there if one of them gets to hang out with a cool wolf bro and the other one doesn't. But it does seem as though Egwene has a little bit more control over herself in the dream. She seems to understand it on a more deep level, whereas Perrin seems to just sort of be in it. But it's hard to say how that's going to go in the future. But it is kind of cool to see both of them sort of entering this dream space from different angles and looking differently. I think it's cooler to see that here, that the dream isn't just part of the wolf stuff. It's actually somewhat separate from the wolf stuff, but not completely. So that's pretty cool by itself. It comes in a big part in the ending, but we'll get to that a little bit later. The other cool thing we saw from Egwene in particular was her trial, which was very, very cool. I mean, just badass Egwene as Amyrlin, who hasn't taken the oaths and is using balefire, and just the way she's acting. She sees Rand's in trouble, and she doesn't have to sit and think about it for a long time. She doesn't worry about it a lot. She's kind of just like, all right, what are we doing? This is a possible sort of potential future, so we might not see exactly this. She might not actually be Amyrlin. She might not actually get to avoid the oaths, though that did seem specific enough that I am wondering if she is going to somehow dodge the oaths in the future. But it was very cool just seeing how badass she was, and I hope we're going to get more of that Egwene in the future. Egwene really hasn't had that many chances to shine yet, but you can tell there's kind of a badass under the very young woman that she is right now, and if she can kind of grow into being the badass full time later on, that'll be super cool. I loved that little scene of her. I want more of that. I also loved the bit about her having the dream triangle and bringing it with her and wondering if that was going to mess it up. And then it's a little ambiguous whether that is what messed it up or if it was deliberate interference, maybe a Black Aja thing or something like that. But I did kind of like it. I got to feel kind of clever thinking, I wonder if the ring's going to mess it up, just because it reminded me of an Forgotten Realms Dungeons and Dragons. You can't put a bag of holding into, I think actually most forms of D&D do this, but you can't put a bag of holding or anything like that has like a dimensional pocket into another thing that is an extra dimensional space. Like you can't put a bag of holding into a bag of holding. I kind of thought the triangle, the dream triangle and the vision triangle might be kind of similar, and that was kind of a cool touch. It might have just been a red herring for it actually being Black Aja interference, or it might have just been very good world building that it kind of fleshed things out, and I thought that was cool. For Nynaeve, we see that she is just very, very talented in an intuitive way, and that's really being emphasized for her, that Egwene is very, very skilled, and she has a lot of innate kind of talents that nobody teaches her, but she's still fairly methodical. She kind of studies going into it. I hate to compare her to Hermione because I think she actually is a very, very different character from Hermione. I think Hermione was more studious, ambitious, in a more like book sense, and she definitely did a lot of action scenes, but she always, in the action scenes, Hermione always kind of took a step back. We actually see at the end of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone that she kind of, in the last scene, she has a whole speech about how it has to be Harry that goes on, because yes, she knows book learning and whatnot, but she's not, the action hero that Harry is, which, in fairness, I think a little bit is rolled back in the other Harry Potter books, but that was the end of the first book. Sometimes people forget that Hermione herself was like, oh, I'm not actually the protagonist of this book. Harry, you go ahead. It was kind of a dumb scene, frankly. I didn't really like it. I think Hermione deserved better than that. But in any case, Egwene doesn't have that scene. Egwene is just constantly like, why am I not in the actions? Put me in. Like, I can do it. I can do it just as well as anyone else. Why couldn't I do it? And sometimes it comes off as a little entitled or spoiled or stupid, but as we're seeing inside of her vision, that could be pretty badass. Again, back to Nynaeve, trying to get away from Egwene. Nynaeve is a little bit different, that she's a little bit more up in her own head. She has her temper to take care of. She's got some real problems with being a hypocrite. It's actually something I've noticed from Robert Jordan in general, is he does this thing with humor where characters will say something that's so blatantly hypocritical that that's the entire joke, where they kind of come off as a clown because they have so little self-awareness. We see this once in a while from Rand and from Egwene, but we see it a lot from Nynaeve, where she'll say that somebody's, doing something stupid, and it's like exactly what she always does, or, she's real hypocritical, but she's trying not to be. She's trying to get better. She's got a real anger problem. She's kind of trying to work on it. But what she has is a real intuitive feel for how things work. She doesn't have as much of the studying as Egwene has. She has more just doing it. And where we really see this is where she sees the Amerlin use air to bind someone, and she sees it one time. And later on, in a moment of crisis, she's able to do it again without even thinking about it. And I think this is probably going to come up more in the future books. It's hard to say right now. This might be speculation. Maybe there's at different stages of the development. Maybe Nynaeve is a bit further along. But I think this is supposed to be because Nynaeve was a wilder. She kind of had to figure things out on her own. Whereas Egwene is getting more lessons, and she's really diving into those lessons, where Egwene is kind of learning things intentionally. She's sort of taking the steps to learn how they go together and kind of intellectualizing it. Whereas Nynaeve is really just kind of bundling it all up and then just kind of doing it. And so far, it's only in a rage. But if she can get past that and then just latch on to just the intuitive, that she doesn't have to think this is how it works and this is how it works and I can put these two things together. Instead, she can just be like, just there you go. That's a spell. That'd be very cool to see that. 'Cause, again, we don't really see that from Egwene. We don't really see much at all from Elaine yet. But I'm going to guess that she's going to be a little bit more like Egwene there, where she's going to study things and do them very methodically. Whereas I think Nynaeve's going to be our real, in Dungeons and Dragons terms, we're going to have Egwene and Elaine, I think, are going to be more of our wizards with their spell books and their prepared spells. And I think we're going to have Nynaeve a little bit more of our sorcerer, who just sort of does magic and doesn't have to understand how it works because she understands what she wants. And going from where she is to where she wants to be is more of a matter of will than it is a matter of planning or studying or in that other boring nonsense that's really more for other people. So we saw some kind of cool early stuff there that I'm guessing is going to continue on in the next books. Again, I'm getting a little bit of the same vibe I got with Matt in books 1 and 2, where I think the girls, although they've had some cool action scenes, they've had some really interesting stuff, it still feels like they're sort of waiting to actually become main characters, and they're not quite there yet. They're sort of still in preparation. So hopefully we'll see more later on. Or I'm totally interpreting that incorrectly. It's hard to say at this point, but that's the impression I get. So the other thing we see with the girls is that their main conflict has nothing to do with magic. It has nothing to do with good and evil. It's completely just working together. And this is something I've brought up before with Moraine in particular in the first book, that it seems like the Aes Sedai are just intentionally training people how to not work in a team. It's really, really stupid. It's really frustrating to read. Now, granted, I don't think it's bad writing. I'm going to get to what I think this might mean in a second, but just to say what I mean, in the first book, I already talked a little bit about it, that Moraine could have saved herself a ton of headache if she had just kind of opened up to the boys a little bit, been a little bit transparent, and made them feel a little bit more like the team, then they would have actually shared things with her. And in fact, we actually see this in this book, where Perrin finally does actually come forward and kind of, he tells Moraine about his wolf powers. And for him, that's a huge leap of faith. He has no idea what Moiraine's going to do about this. She might instantly betray him. Once he does that, she actually does open up a bit more. She's very honest, saying, oh, well, some people would gentle you for this, but I'm not going to. It's concerning, but let's talk about it. And, then they actually start to open up a dialogue, and they get to have a little bit of mutual trust. Only because Perrin took the first step. Perrin, who's like 18, 19 at this point, something like that. Moiraine is old enough to be his mother, it seems, and she's also been trained. Like, the Aes Sedai are trained to be advisors and politicians and manipulators. How is she worse at working together, at being in a team and actually talking to other people than a 19-year-old boy? It doesn't make any sense at all, unless you kind of dig down to what Robert Jordan probably meant by it. But anyway, so that's what I saw with Moiraine. We're seeing kind of the same thing with the girls here, that Nynaeve was the wisdom back home, and she's also several years older than Egwene and Elaine, and she feels like she should still be in charge. She's older, she's more experienced, she's further ahead. She was, her career with the Aes Sedai had a head start compared to the others. So, even though she was a wilder. So she's sort of feeling like she should still be in charge, and people should do what she says. Whereas Egwene is saying, well, maybe that's how it worked back home, but that's not how it works here with the Aes Sedai. And sure, you're a little bit ahead, but not that much. And I think that actually I should have more of a say. And it really feels like this should be a very simple conversation or two. Like, they've known each other for a long time, but it takes them the whole damn book to have any kind of connection at all where they address this. Granted, they do address it a bit. At the very end, we have the little scene where Egwene needs to fall asleep, and she sort of asks Nynaeve to sing to her like when she was little, where she's kind of like, okay, I still do need you. But for most of the book, she's completely like, I don't need any help at all from Nynaeve at all whatsoever, and I know what to do. And they're both just always contradicting each other, and then they're both feeling like the other one's doing the contradicting. And it really is like, just sit down and talk about it for a minute. And we see this from all the Aes Sedai, that just none of them ever seem to understand. You could just, transparency and such is really important, not just for interpersonal relationships in general, but particularly for when you're trying to be a leader of any type. That, first off, just having everyone trying to be a leader doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And then second off, that leadership, shouldn't just be this domineering, I'm in charge, I'm the strongest, so you all have to do what I say. We're really finding that doesn't usually work in most contexts. I was a software engineer for many years. I was a manager for a while. I did a lot of training on leadership. I went to a lot of, sessions. I did a lot of, reading, a lot of working with my team. And maybe it's different in a military context. I don't really know. Maybe in military, you really do need to have just the biggest brute in front and everybody else follows. I'm a little skeptical of that, but I'll admit I haven't ever served in the military, so I don't know. But certainly in the corporate world, and I think in almost every team environment, things really work better when the leadership is more of a partnership and it's more supporting, it's more enabling. I mean, the most difficult thing I had to learn when becoming a manager was how to keep my mouth closed and to listen to other people. That when I talk, I'm not supposed to just give them advice and tell them what to do. I'm supposed to more ask them probing questions to figure out what their own problem is, and then sort of wait for them to ask me for help. And that even when you're coaching someone, it goes much better if you say, hey, would you like some coaching? Or it seems like you're having a hard time with that. I've worked on it myself. Maybe I can show you how to work it. Or, hey, would you like to have a bit of a pairing session with me where we work on it together? You ask, and then they either say yes or no, rather than just kind of walking in and being like, here, let me do it. I know how it's done. And that micromanaging really doesn't work. It doesn't work in a corporation. It doesn't work in small teams. I don't know why the Aes Sedai aren't doing that. It seems very, very stupid. Except that I think Robert Jordan has a real point here. So first off, I think a little bit this is just subverting the expectation of not having a very stereotypical group of women. You could definitely imagine a version of this where someone says, oh, well, it's an organization run by women and therefore everyone's going to work together and be peaceful. If the whole world were run by women, there'd be no war and there'd be no conflict. And it's like, that doesn't make any sense. Of course, there'd still be war and conflict. It's not that big of a difference between men and women. There might be some superficial differences in how the war and conflict sound or something like that, but it'd probably be pretty similar in most ways. There's toxicity, and we can talk about toxic masculinity and stuff like that, but the Aes Sedai have a lot of that same exact toxic masculinity in their structure. I mean, they literally have grown women, leering at young boys training, trying to decide who's going to claim them. I mean, we have just that sort of sexual harassment from them. We have the very domineering hierarchy, read by a single strong ruler at the top. You know, everyone is constantly looking. Like, a lot of these things are stereotypically things you imagine when dealing with a toxic organization of men in the real world. And I think that Robert Jordan is intentionally sort of showing that in a women organization in Wheel of Time. And I think we're actually seeing that in general in this culture. That this is a world where it's not simply run by women, but there's far more leadership from women than there is from men. And granted, things aren't quite as one-sided as you would think from history either. Like, there's definitely been female leaders, queens. I think we had a female Holy Roman Emperor at one point, maybe more than one. I don't really recall at the top of my head. But, I mean, it's not like it's only been run by men through all of history. But it was definitely like 80% men, 20% women or something like that. Wheel of Time might be more like 70-30. I don't know the exact split. I'm kind of just pulling out numbers here. But it's definitely more female-dominated. We have the Aes Sedai are a female organization. Only women can channel unless they're a man who's going to go mad and they're all in hiding or crazed and they're being hunted openly. Even inside towns and such, we see things like the Women's Circle has at least as much power as the Council. Though even the wording there that the Council versus the Women's Circle does kind of set it apart as women versus... So there's a very long conversation we could potentially have there. But another thing I have noticed about the gender relations in here is... So when people are talking, there's a lot of statements that people will make that are just generalizing the other gender. There's a lot of, like, oh, well, no one can understand women, or, no one can understand men. And to some extent, I think Robert Jordan is just trying to kind of capture the way people talk in, like, a small town. That this is kind of folksy. There's a lot of sort of just sayings and a lot of generalizations, and people don't really care about it as much. And maybe they even hold within that very small environment. I think that's probably why you see a lot more of that inside small towns and inside larger areas. And once you have a city with people from all different cultures, a lot of those sayings kind of break down. But they actually might hold a little bit when you're in a very small bubble. And I think he's partially trying to capture that. But I have noticed that it happens more from women talking about men than it does with men talking about women. It's not to say that men don't. Like, we certainly have male characters saying, like, oh, yeah, no one can understand women, or who could ever understand women. We have the ongoing joke of Matt, Perrin, and Rand all thinking that the other ones know how girls work and they don't. And it's like, well, Matt's the only one that does, but they all think that another one does. Like, even Matt thinks, like, oh no, I have no idea what I'm doing here. And it's like, I don't know how you think that, Matt. Women seem to love you, but whatever. But we see far more often that it's women saying it about men. We have lines like, there's one from Fail where she said, I just really like this one. Men fight when they should run and fools fight when they should run, but I'd no need to say it twice. And part of what I've noticed here is when men say things like this about women, they will fairly often restrict it to only Aes Sedai. There'll be things like never trust Aes Sedai or something like that. Sometimes about women as a whole, sometimes about Aes Sedai. Women, when they're saying it, and they're saying it at least as often as the men, if not more often, are always just generalizing it. And I think this isn't just that they're supposed to be insufferable. Like, it's definitely frustrating to read all these characters just constantly overgeneralizing everybody else, usually when they're angry or they're embarrassed or something, and they're just trying to cover for their own frustration. Like, both from the men and the women, when they're doing this in the book, it's usually they're mad and they're just generalizing, which is good writing. That's how people generalize. I mean, that's, when you're angry, you're more likely to say stupid crap like that. But I think there is supposed to a little bit be here this idea that since society is imbalanced, that it's not just that things are more equal than they are in real life, it's that, Side-In is tainted, Side-Ar is not, so women have more power. The genders are imbalanced on a cosmic sense. I mean, literally, the male half of the source is tainted, it's polluted. And we're seeing this sort of imbalance in culture, which I think is a real political statement that when half of the magic source is tainted, we see the imbalances in gender that actually feel a little bit like the imbalances we see inside real life. Like, the Aes Sedai very much feel like sort of the old boys club just with women. Like, it doesn't feel like a uniquely, like, oh, if women were in power, this is what they do. It's like, well, when you have a bunch of men in power, this is what they do. And if they were women instead, it would look pretty similar. It's just instead of wigs and suits or what have you for men throughout history, wearing their getup. Instead, it's stoles and dresses. That's really it's a minor difference in costume, and then aside from that, the Aes Sedai feel like they could just be a bunch of overprivileged senators or something like that, talking, just expecting everybody else to do things they want for them. So I think this is an intentional statement here, showing what things are like, and then flipping the genders around in order to force the audience to read it a bit more and kind of engage with it on a different level. If it was just holding up the ones from real life, then it would just feel like more of the same. It would be hard to tell what was just realism and what was a specific statement. I think flipping it around does a better job of kind of showing that, okay, the genders are imbalanced. This is what that looks like, with the hope that the audience will be like, oh, this actually reminds me a little bit of how it is in real life, only with the positions flipped. Like maybe in our turning of the wheel, it's Saidar that has been tainted and Saidin that has not been. And because of that, we're seeing the imbalances that we see in modern life. Maybe it's not. Maybe Robert Jordan just hated women. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes because the girls really are very frustrating to read at times. But it's just the writing is so skillful. It seems so intentional that I don't think the takeaway is supposed to just be that these characters are annoying. I think there's more going on here. I'll probably have more to talk about this in future books, but this definitely came out a lot in all the squabbling between Nynaeve and Egwene in here. Honestly, it felt very realistic. That's the other thing. I've been talking about this with friends, and I sometimes get some feedback that people think that I'm being a little bit too hard on characters like Egwene in particular, but also Nynaeve, that they're not being that annoying and their squabbling isn't unrealistic for teenagers. Part of what we're seeing there is that I think the teenage male characters are actually kind of unrealistically mature in here. Like even Matt, as much as he's silly, he seems like an immature 25-year-old, not an immature like 18, 19-year-old. I think, you could look at it the other way, just that Nynaeve and Egwene and Elaine are far more realistic young women, and the male characters all feel like they should be 8 years older than they are based on how mature they're acting. Even when they're being stupid, it feels like stupid for a 25-year-old, not for a 19-year-old. Whereas when Egwene's being stupid, it feels like it's stupid for like a 16, 17-year-old. And when Nynaeve's being stupid, same. It feels like it's stupid for someone in their early 20s, if not a little bit younger. So some of this might just be that the girls are written more realistically than the boys. It's kind of hard to tell. But just given all the stuff with the Aes Sedai as well, I think there's also a little bit of an intentional thing here, that the Aes Sedai are bad at teamwork because they're overprivileged, and that makes it so it's difficult for them to work in a team. They're not being trained to work in teams, they're being trained to dominate, and when that doesn't work, all the tools they have are just to press harder. They don't have the ability to step back and use some empathy to try to share their power a little bit, to maybe be transparent and bring the other person up to their level. Instead, it's just look down and like, no, you have to obey me because I'm Aes Sedai and you're not, and therefore obey me. Or even within the Aes Sedai, I'm stronger than you, I'm higher, and I'm accepted and you're a novice, or I'm a full Aes Sedai and you're only accepted, and therefore you have to do what I say. Like all the Aes Sedai hazing rituals just really remind me of like a spoiled frat or something like that, where it's just, yeah, it definitely builds cohesion for the team, but it also absolutely maintains the strict, toxic power structure. And it's very interesting to see all this. Again, it's hard for me to piece it all together, but I think that's just because there's a lot here to dig into. Robert Jordan has done an excellent job of crafting this very complex situation that maps to the real world only indirectly and through a bit of a filter, and therefore makes us think about it harder. All right, so let's talk about Baalzamon. And to do that, I first need to read a little segment from the prologue to The Eye of the World. Behind him, the air rippled, shimmered, solidified into a man who looked around, his mouth twisting briefly with distaste. Not so tall as Lews Therin, he was clothed in all black, save for the snow-white lace at his throat and the silverwork on the turned-down tops of his thigh-high boots. He stepped carefully, handling his cloak fastidiously to avoid brushing the dead. The floor trembled with aftershocks, but his attention was fixed on the man staring into the mirror and laughing. "Lord of the morning," he said, "I have come for you." The laughter cut off as though it had never been, and Lews Therin turned, seeming unsurprised. "Ah, a guest. Have you the voice, stranger? It will soon be time for the singing, and here all are welcome to take part. Ilenia, my love, we have a guest. Ilenia, where are you?" The black-clad man's eyes widened, darted the body of the golden-haired woman, then back to Lews Therin. Shaitan take you. Does the taint already have you so far in its grip? That name, Lews Therin shuddered and raised a hand as though to ward off something. You mustn't say that name. It is dangerous. So you remember that much, at least. Dangerous for you, fool, not for me. What else do you remember? Remember, you light-blinded idiot. I will not let it end with you swaddled in unawareness. Remember. For a moment, Lews Therin stared at his raised hand, fascinated by the patterns of grime. Then he wiped his hand on his even dirtier cloak and turned his attention back to the other man. Who are you? What do you want? The black-clad man drew himself up arrogantly. Once I was called Ellen Moraine Tadernai, but now, betrayer of hope. It was a whisper from Lews Therin. Memory stirred, but he turned his head, shying away from it. So that bit's from the prologue, again, of Eye of the World. And it's real relevant right now for anyone who still thinks that Baalzamon is Shaitan, rather than being betrayer of hope, in the Old Tongue, Ishmael, one of the Forsaken. Baalzamon being the Trolloc name for the Dark One, meaning, I think it was Heart of the Dark. Yeah, Heart of the Dark. And we now know, alright, Baalzamon is not Shaitan. Frankly, we've been suspecting for a little while now that Shaitan wasn't just this guy. Shaitan was somehow more elemental than this. But now we know. Rand, once again, had to figure out the dumb way, which I want to read one more short quote here of when Rand first... I mean, we saw it at the end of the first book as well, that he doesn't even kill Baalzamon. He just wounds him, and then immediately decides that he's defeated Shaitan and won the whole battle between good and evil. Again, here, this time at least there was a body, but still, he has... I have done it, he thought. I have killed Baalzamon, killed Shaitan. I have won the last battle. Light, I am the Dragon Reborn, the breaker of nations, the breaker of the world. No, I will end the breaking, end the killing. I will make it end. And it's just like, Rand, buddy, you just, from now on, whenever you think you defeated, like, the concept of evil, just check with Moraine to see if she agrees with you. Because he just keeps jumping to it, and then Moraine has to be like, I'm not really sure what I'm expecting if we were to defeat Shaitan, but I know it's not nobody and nothing, but it's also definitely not one body with just like a smoking hole in it and then nothing else. It's like, oh, what are you expecting? It's like, I don't really know. It's not going to be a random dead guy. Like, that's probably not it. You're probably not going to defeat the Dark One imprisoned by the creator at the moment of creation, and it'll just be like a dead guy on the floor. Like, it's probably not it. So that was hilarious. I'm really curious if we're going to see Rand do this anymore, or if the third time we'll really finally do it. But so far, kind of just funny. It also just really makes us think too, like, can we even kill Shaitan? What is Shaitan? Like, we still don't know at all what Shaitan even is. Is Shaitan just an elemental force of evil? Like, in Islam, this is more the spirits, the evil spirits that whisper into the hearts of people and jinn. Maybe that's what Shaitan is here as well. It's just sort of the whispering voice gnawing at people's minds. Or maybe it's just a giant that'll climb out of a hole in the pit of doom in the last book and then literally just put on a giant set of armor and fight Rand. Like, we really have no idea what Shaitan is at this point. I tend to think it's going to be more elemental and mysterious and otherworldly, but I mean, we really don't know. We might get to Tarman Gaiden and he's literally just going to be Goliath standing in front of the army, and that'll this, oh shit, it's Shaitan. He's tall. I mean, we really don't know at this point. But it's definitely not going to just be like a guy. We're pretty confident of that. But Baalzamon himself is also very interesting. This is just... I mean, really, we don't know everything about him. We know that he wasn't really fully human. I mean, he had the fire eyes. He had some weird stuff going on. It's hard to tell if that was just like an illusion he was doing to be more cool, or if this was a spell that he cast, if this was something he channeled to make himself more powerful, or perhaps he didn't do it. Maybe Shaitan did it to him. And then, even then, would this be Shaitan doing this to mark him as his sort of official emissary? Was he, in a sense, an avatar of Shaitan? I've been wondering that for a while, if he was just like Shaitan's avatar. Or maybe it was a punishment. Maybe he overstepped his bounds by calling himself Baalzamon, and this was a punishment from Shaitan for impersonating him and being, blasphemous and taking the role too seriously. We really don't know, and we might never know now. I mean, Baalzamon's dead. So that might be the end of it. Maybe he was the big bad of the first 3 books, and then after that, we're going to have different people. I mean, if he's just one of the Forsaken, then maybe that's it. Then we have a bunch more Forsaken to deal with. But do bear in mind that Shaitan is also the Lord of the Grave, so maybe Ba'alzamon will actually come back up again. I mean, presumably dying is still bad for the Forsaken. They certainly don't want to die, even though Shaitan is the Lord of the Grave. But we don't really know if that's because they don't want to die, or if it's because Shaitan doesn't want them to die. For all we know, Shaitan can still make just as much use of Ba'alzamon in death as he could in life. We really don't know. It could just be that Ishamael didn't want to die. Maybe he loses his individuality or his free will or something. And like he might come up in the next book as an undead, like some kind of a lich, or some kind of an undead knight or something like that. For all we know, we really don't know at this point, which is part of what I love so much about these books, that we have all sorts of bad guys and forces. We have the Children of the Light and Shan Shan as sort of bad guys that are very, very human. We have the Forsaken as bad guys that are sort of godlike, but are still ultimately, wizards. And then we have Shaitan, who we still don't know if Shaitan is just like the color of evil, or if Shaitan is actually like just a big sleeping imprisoned god giant or something like that. Like, we really don't know. I mean, it could be anything at this point. But I am starting to wonder how much killing Shaitan will even make sense. I mean, imprisoned by the creator at the moment of creation, that kind of implies that that Shaitan is a critical part of the world, doesn't it? Like, maybe killing Shaitan wouldn't even be desirable. Maybe that would be like killing the source or something like that. We really don't know at this point, which is very cool. That like whenever we learn something new, it seems like we're just getting more questions rather than actually finding final answers. And I'm so excited to see where this will go in the future. And again, whether we'll even see Ba'alzamon again, because maybe we won't. Like, maybe he was just a guy that chose a cool name. I mean, cultists do that all the time. They'll say, I am the devil, or, I am Jesus. And maybe that's what we have here. He's just one of the kind of cultists here. Maybe he even came to believe it himself. Like, maybe he thought he was the Dark One. Or anything else. We really don't know, and maybe we never will. But it's cool to speculate about. All right, we need to talk about the ending, which was just awesome. And honestly, there's not even that much to say about it, other than it was awesome, but I'm going to try for a minute because it was really cool and I want to talk about it. So I think more than anything else, what made it awesome isn't just that some cool things happen, it's that all the different threads tie together so perfectly. I mean, we are starting to see this with the Wheel of Time in general, that the book starts and everybody kind of goes off in their own direction, and then by the end, they kind of all kind of come back together, and there's some big climax where everyone kind of just shows up at the right place. But in the Dragon Reborn in particular, it's just woven together so well. And I think this really helps to kind of emphasize the whole theme of the pattern here too, that we have our Ta'veren that all kind of had very different paths. And then they all come together in very different ways, but it still feels like, if you take a step back, it feels like it all makes sense. It's like, oh, well, they all had to be there for Rand to seize Callandor from the stone. But how they get there, I mean, we have Matt blowing a hole with fireworks in the side of the building and climbing in that way. His battle is fireworks and, fighting with a quarterstaff against people. Then we have Egwene, not Ta'veren, but still present, doing her dream stuff to intervene. And they're kind of part of it. They're in the same area, but it's not really the same thing that, like, the Ta'veren are doing. Like, they're sort of like, it's clearly related, but it's still a little bit different. So that's just kind of like Egwene and the girls are there in the dream and in Tyr, but just somewhat separately, more to like to deal with their own adventure. Then we have Perrin entering through the wolf dream, which feels different from Egwene's dream, but it might not be. It's so hard to tell whether their dreams are the same and they're just seeing it from a different perspective. I mean, it's entirely possible they literally look the same. It's just Perrin is seeing it through a wolf's eyes and Egwene is seeing it through her eyes. That, the same open meadow can be just a beautiful place filled with adorable, critters and nice flowers and, nice, like, grass and plains and stuff like that. And then through a wolf's eyes, the same exact thing is filled with lots of delicious critters and lots of great places to stalk and hide and to run. Like, it could be exactly the same, or it might actually look different. It's kind of hard to tell, but they're both there, but it feels different. Rand enters the dream following through a portal, which, is that the same as either of them? Or, like, it's kind of hard to even tell. Are they all entering the same dream in the same way? Are they all entering the same dream in different ways? Or do we have three different ways of entering either the same or three different slightly... Like, there's so many different interpretations for what's happening here. But it all flows perfectly. The best moment of this, I think, is when Perrin is trying to break down the door to save Fail. It's a big bronze door, and he's pounding on it 3 times. And it makes a big resounding sound like a bell. The first time, the second time, and the third time it's cut short and it shatters. We then jump shortly afterwards to Rand's perspective, where he hears somewhere just in the distance a bell tolling twice and then being cut short. And then we know, okay, so this is happening after that moment, but only shortly afterwards, and near enough to hear, but not near enough that he can tell what's going on. So we have these sort of implicit, fluid, organic changes of perspective, but with some rooting, like some pivot elements. Like, again, a lot of stuff going on in here reminds me of a lot of film techniques where you have like an anchor object when you have different perspectives in the same building. You might have a single object or like a weird clock or something like that, so that, like, no matter where you shoot it from in the building, you can still kind of orient yourself by saying, like, yes, I can still see the clock, so okay, now I'm seeing it from the left side, so we're on that side of the room. I got a similar vibe here to how we have the sound of the door, and then we hear it again from Rand's perspective, so we can kind of say, okay, even though it looks different, we're still kind of in the same place, and, just after that, chronologically, which is just so well done. Honestly, as an aspiring author, this is daunting to read, because I don't know how you do this. I don't know how a person puts this together and makes it this fluid. It's just absolutely amazing. It blew my mind. That was so cool. I hope we're going to see more of that in the books. I mean, again, this sort of pattern is already sort of present in the other books, but it was done so smoothly and perfectly here. It just felt so satisfying and cool and abstract and otherworldly, so artful. I really hope we see more of this in the future books, because it absolutely blew me away. Okay, so that's most of what I wanted to talk about. I just have a couple other little things I just wanted to call out. So first off, just having Callandor, the sword. I mean, I think I joked at the beginning of the video about this kind of being a King Arthur thing. That really goes without saying. Obviously, it's interesting that inside this universe, Rand is clearly doing some King Arthur stuff here, where he's going to the stone with the sword in it. He's taking the sword from the stone. The once and future king. He was once this important person in the past. He was Lews Therin Telamon, and then he's being reborn. Like this, there's a lot of King Arthur stuff going on here. But in universe, we know that Arthur Hawkwing Pendragon he's King Arthur, is a different person. We see him when the horn is blown, and he's not Rand. So as far as we can tell, unless I'm misinterpreting something there, it seems like Rand and Lews Therin are not King Arthur, and there's a separate King Arthur, even though that mythology is still present here, which is very weird and interesting. It's feeling very Robert Jordan, just to have a real myth that is being repeated in this age, but just it's changed even more, that like now it's not even actually King Arthur doing the things that King Arthur did. It's very interesting. At some point, we might need to do a deep dive into just Arthurian mythology, chivalric romance in general, kind of in connection to this. But, suffice to say, obviously, the sword and the stone, that's I think everyone picked up on that one, that's a King Arthur reference, but I probably need to say it. But it is just cool. And then, of course, Callandor is a cool sword. I'm a little curious about the specific name. I mean, it seems like it's trying to sort of give the impression of Callandor, which is, I think that means hard cleft. It's a name used for kind of a collection of swords, one of whom being Excalibur. But there's some other examples that are similar to that. But it sounds like Callandor, Callandor. I think that's an intentional sound-alike. And then we have Andor, presumably the place Andor here, which Andor, I'm not sure where that came from exactly. I know that in Lord of the Rings, Andor was another name for Numenor. So that might be another Lord of the Rings reference, or I might be missing that that's actually a common reference to some other thing. I mean, more recent things that we're referencing, referencing Wheel of Time and other works like that. Warcraft 3 has places called Andor Hall in there. Whether they were referencing Lord of the Rings or Wheel of Time here is hard to say. Warcraft 3 famously referenced Song of Ice and Fire a lot, so it wouldn't surprise me if they also were pulling some things from Wheel of Time as well. But it was definitely a cool sword, definitely just cool stuff. Just the idea of it, a sword that's not a sword, is just a cool idea. And then just, I mean, who doesn't like cool swords? It's a cool sword. Another just little tiny thing I just wanted to call out. I love the attention to detail Robert Jordan has for things like flags and clothing to set different cultures apart. One I liked in particular is the one for Tyr, which was, just to make sure I have it right, it's a silver gauntleted hand surrounded by lightning bolts, which seems like a reference to the mythical god Tyr, who had a silver gauntlet, a one-armed god in various versions of stories, probably related to the god Tiwaz, which is also related to like Zeus and Thor as a lightning deity. There's a lot going on there, but it's just cool to see that like we have this place Tyr, which they're spelling Tear, but said presumably very similar to the god Tyr, usually spelled with a Tyr. From our like old like European mythology. It's just cool to see that like, okay, just in case you were wondering, is Tyr the same as Tyr? The flag is a silver gauntleted hand with lightning bolts around it. So yeah, it's the same reference. I thought that was cool. Like just having different banners and flags that feel realistic. They're not overcomplicated. Most of the banners we're seeing seem like real world banners. They're not over designed or anything like that. Like in a lot of movies and video games, banners sometimes will be a little bit overdone because it looks cooler, whereas you really want to be simple enough to be recognizable from a distance. A silver gauntlet with some lightning bolts seems like a pretty realistic, symbol to me. So I kind of liked seeing that. That was kind of fun. I also really liked just a little bit from the Children of the Light in the prologue. We didn't really see a lot from them in this book, particularly compared to the last book, but I love just seeing these little tiny hints here and there that the Paternail has things he's trying to do. The Children of the Light are still active. Unless I missed something, we're still not 100% sure who Bors is, but it seems like he's probably Caridin. So maybe we'll find out for sure in the future, or maybe I missed a clue, but I'm getting the impression that he's Caridin. But in general, I just really love how Robert Jordan has a lot of characters and factions, and even when you don't really see them front and center, you know they're up to something in the background. Like we saw this with Perrin, that his wolf powers were progressing kind of off screen in the last book, and then we see where they've kind of come inside this one, that he's made some progress since the first book. Children of the Light, I think we're going to see the same thing, that we have a little bit in the prologue kind of hinting that they're going to be up to something. They're having plans, and they're going to make their move, but we don't really know what it is yet because it hasn't come up. That doesn't mean they're not preparing, though, so when they do show up, they're going to have, whatever they've been doing in the background will then become apparent. And presumably it's the same for the Shan-Shan, that we're not seeing them now. That probably doesn't mean they're all just stopped doing stuff. It means they're biding their time or preparing or maybe getting ships or something. We don't really know, but the fact that we haven't heard a lot about them doesn't mean they're not doing anything. It just means that we haven't seen it yet. And I absolutely love this. It makes the world feel so much more full. It makes things so much more unsettling. It gives us so much more urgency that even when we don't see the threat up close, we're still like, we gotta hurry up and find a way around it, because even though they haven't made their move now, all that means is they're biding their time. It's going to be that much worse for how long we've waited. That's so cool. All right, last thing. As someone from Wisconsin, I absolutely loved the bit in Alien about the King's Palace and the Great Hall of the Council. That, what was it? Just want to make sure I don't get it wrong. Fael explains that the king said the council could have any palace they wished so long as it wasn't larger than his, so they made a duplicate that's just 2 feet smaller in every dimension. So in Wisconsin, there's actually legislation saying that no building can be taller than the columns surrounding the Capitol dome. And the Capitol is just 3 feet and 1/2 inch shorter than the nation's capital in DC. So it's a very similar thing that in Madison, Wisconsin, they have that legislation. I don't actually know if it's obeyed or not. I could have sworn some of the buildings on campus were taller than that. I could have sworn that Van Hise was a taller building, but I'm not 100% sure. I know that the legislation exists that buildings can't be taller than the columns, and then that the building itself is just a little bit smaller than the nation's capital in DC. And then if you look at the architecture, I'll put a picture up. The Madison, Wisconsin state capitol has a very similar architecture to the nation's capital. It's it's a bit of weird Wisconsin trivia that we have a similar thing going on as inside Ilium. So that's kind of fun. All right, so that's all I had to talk about for the Dragon Reborn. If you liked it, please like and subscribe. If you watched it, whether you liked it or didn't like it, please leave me a comment with any feedback. I said this the last couple of videos as well. I really do not know what I'm doing for making video content like this. I have not done video editing. I haven't done filming in the past. I've been writing these blog posts for a little while now, but I still am a little bit lost. So if there's anything I could improve, anything you liked, disliked, please let me know. I really value the feedback. I'm not going to be offended or anything like that. Even if it's mean, at least getting the signal is great. You know, is the video too long? Would you like it to be shorter? Would it be better if I kept it the same length but divided it into smaller chunks, had maybe 2 or 3 videos with different topics per book? Would it be better if I simply had shorter videos? Or is it great the way it is where it's long like this? I personally love a long video I can put on while I'm playing a video game or, you know, doing some chores around the house, but I know other people prefer to have short little bite-sized content. So let me know what you think. I really appreciate all of it, and I really hope you enjoyed what I had here. So until next time.